All right, welcome everyone. We are going to get started here with our third part in our webinar series, Essential Australia with Mark Davidson, the official educator of Wine Australia for North America. Welcome back, Mark. We're glad to have you. Thank you for surviving the holidays. I hope everything was well.
Yes, there's no risk of me not surviving the holidays. Yes, hope everyone had a nice break. Hope you did. And happy to see the back end of 2020 disappearing over the horizon, I have to say.
Yes, nothing really changed. Things got weirder all of a sudden, but nonetheless.
It actually did get a bit weirder. I was positive until last week, but there we go. We'll see what happens.
These things, the world's a crazy place, but we'll keep talking about Australia. I think we're going to talk about Margaret River today.
Awesome. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, please chime in there. Yes, well, welcome everyone. Hope everyone had a nice break. Back at it now for a quick look. This is a slightly shorter one than the last time, simply because we're not covering as much information. But off to Margaret River and Great Southern. I think Great Southern was an important piece of the puzzle for your portfolio largely because of one particular producer, but also a little confusing in the sense that you've got that producer, Howard Park, but they also actually have quite a lot of Margaret River wines in there. But trying to understand Great Southern requires more than a session like this because it's a big area. But we'll have a quick look at it, sort of a 10,000 foot view of what's happening at Great Southern. And it's very few wines, unfortunately, from Great Southern in the US. Yours are sort of about the only ones, bar one or two others. But anyway, let's get after it. So Margaret River. Yeah, I'm not supposed to have favorite regions, but I would be lying if I said this wasn't one of them. I love this region. I am totally biased towards it. It is really an interesting one in the sense that it's one of the world's youngest wine regions in terms of a well-known wine region. It was only started in the 60s, and we'll cover off that in a moment. But it's also achieved a lot of great success in Australia, as well as in the international markets in terms of notoriety and sort of ink. And I think the total production in Margaret River represents something like 3 or 4% of Australian wine production. And they definitely get more than 3 or 4% of the press, which sometimes pisses off other regions in Australia because they've sort of come out of nowhere. But it is just one of these really unique and very, very special places. It's very isolated, and we're going to, if Margaret River's isolated, where do we get down to Great Southern? Interesting elements to note would be this move towards more minimal farming. It's a very dynamic winemaking community. It's a super engaging, beautiful place to be. It is, along with other parts of the world. I mean, certainly Chile comes to mind, but it's a grape growing paradise. When we talk about the challenges of climate and this, that, and the other we've had in other parts of Australia, Margaret River isn't not subject to that, but they have had a far more consistent year in, year out, brilliant vintages than is probably fair. Probably known for, it depends on who you talk to, but historically known for Cabernet Sauvignon and Sauvignon Blanc-based blends, but also Chardonnay's turned out to be really world-class, and we'll address that as well. So we'll have a look at the history, geography, climate, and soil, viticulture and winemaking, and then we'll look at the prominent varieties and styles. A little quick snapshot of history. We often talk about John Gladstone's, but before we get to him, I think it's important that that Harold Olmo is a professor of viticulture at University of California. He takes the first steps in establishing Margaret River as a region, recommending basically planting of grapes in this area of Australia, saying there's some really interesting areas. Largely, I think he had more interest in Great Southern. Then in the 60s, Dr. John Gladstone's was a agronomist from the University of Western Australia, and he's really credited. He was basically commissioned to write a paper on the assessment of the viticultural potential of Margaret River specifically. And he did so and came back with the comparisons to Bordeaux. Ultimately came back with comparisons to Bordeaux in a warm vintage. Gravelly soils, maritime climate, suitability of Cabernet, Sauvignon Blanc, and Semillon, those Bordeaux varieties, obviously. But also that ended up turned into being a really, really cool place for Chardonnay, and I'll get that story. There's a little bit of an American connection on that piece as well. 67, this is an important piece for you guys because this relates specifically to Vas Felix. Cullity is the first guy, based on that research and commentary, he was the first guy to plant vineyards. You do talk to Vanya Cullen, claims that they were about the same time, but whatever, who cares? It's a toss of the coin. But the reality is that Vas Felix is noted for being the first modern commercial vineyard there. originally planting Cabernet and Malbec, and those are still growing today. Those are the old vines that are still growing today. And we'll talk more about Malbec in a moment too. It's not quite as part of the picture, but in Bass Felix, it's particularly important. First Chardonnay vines are planted at Lewin. There was also Cullen and Mosswood were experimenting with that. And there's a cool story. There's a bit of a Robert Mondavi connection to Lewin and how that was established, because the owners of Lewin, it's not really one of your portfolios, part of your portfolio, but it's still a cool story and has a nice American connection to it. It also speaks a lot to the brilliance of Robert Mondavi and who he was. The owners of Lewin Estate, they just had a property there. They weren't planting. They were just, according to Dennis Horgan's wife, Trish, she said she thinks he just wanted a property down in Margaret River so he could make an excuse to go surfing. They were accountants. They were chartered accountants. But at one point, there was people walking through the vineyard surveying, or walking through their property rather, surveying it, and they came up and asked questions, and they said they wanted to buy the property, and they said, well, we don't want to sell, but why do you want to buy it? And the discussion came out that, he thought that would be a great place to plant Chardonnay. They said, well, we don't want to sell, but we would love to pay you to consult with us. And, he obviously had something in mind, because clearly, 4 or 5 years later, one of the top Chardonnays, now considered to be one of the top Chardonnays anywhere on the planet, but certainly in Australia, one of the most award-winning Chardonnays is Lewin Estate Art Series from this particular block. Generally, the fruit comes from this particular block, and kind of what Mondavi saw, which I thought was kind of cool. Reputation of Cabernet starts to sort of really get cemented with Kate Mentell winning back-to-back Jimmy Watson trophies. For those of you that don't know, Jimmy Watson trophy is a trophy that for a period of time, maybe that's waned a little bit now, but for a period of time, it was the best red wine, 1-year-old red wine at a wine show. And that was considered to be, it launched the international career of Wolf Blass and a few other producers too. So it was a pretty big deal in those days. The GI of Margaret River was registered in 1996, and then it just continues to grow from strength to strength. And there's been a lot of talk about. It's been really cool to watch in the sommelier community over the last few years, but particularly at Texom and a few other places where everyone's just gotten particularly excited about the character and the quality of the wines in Margaret River. I may have used this analogy before, but it's one of those things. I remember being in Piedmont not so long ago, and I didn't have a crappy wine the entire time I was there. And I think, wow, isn't it nice when your basic wines are delicious and really high quality? This is Margaret River to a T. There's no basic bulk production. Well, I'm sure that exists. I haven't seen it though, but everything coming out of Margaret River starts at a very, very high quality. Even if it's priced well, the quality is incredibly high, and there's basically, no crappy wine. Maybe that's a T-shirt. Margaret River, no crappy wine. That's why I'm not in marketing, by the way. And
yes, the sommelier community loves these wines. And there's good reason for it. It's the quality.
Quality's high. Yeah.
And the bridge that they make between sort of a classic West Coast wine and something from Europe is really advantageous in the sales environment, because it gives you a bridge to move people around and make them happy while they're experimenting without losing them, right? You're not risking that you're going to take them out of their love of California and then give them a kind of Brett-driven Bordeaux by accident and turn them off for your recommendations forever. You're fairly safe moving them here. So
yeah, it's a great thing. I usually use that analogy, and we'll get to that when we talk specifically about the Cabernets as well. But here it is, and for those that have been there, it's a good long flight. You arrive in Sydney, and then if you're heading straight onto Margaret River, you've got another 4 or 5 hour flight across the country. It's kind of like LA to New York. Almost, and then you've got about a 300 kilometer drive, a relatively unremarkable drive straight down to Margaret River. The cool thing about it is, though, once you're sort of heading down this drive, it's not an ugly drive. It's exciting if you've never been there before, but it's not that remarkable. And it's almost like turning the corner here when you get into this part where Margaret River is, and it's not quite turning a corner, but everything changes. The vegetation looks different. The look and the feel of the place is very different from what you'd just seen for the previous 3 or 4 hours in the car. And it's really a special place. Ocean on 3 sides. And the first thing that struck me standing on the beach here, I was there having a look at the surf because I grew up surfing, so I was curious to see it. Next stop out this way. Next stop is, South Africa, and you might miss it and circle the globe another time. It's quite remarkable. There's and I don't know if it's power suggestion necessarily from where I sit, but you smell the ocean. It's different. The Indian Ocean smells different, feels different, but you've got to remember that all the systems are moving that way, heading from west to east. no big bodies of land, the purest sort of rainwater, the air and everything. It's just, there is a freshness and vitality and vibrancy, I believe, in that region that I think is in that. And again, parasuggestion probably, but I feel that that's transferred into the clarity that the wines exhibit. So yeah, definitely a maritime climate, but not cold maritime, cool maritime. Then you've got the Southern Ocean meeting here, the confluence of the Southern and the Indian Oceans right here at the bottom tip of Margaret River. So you've got those cooling effects at the southern part, and then the sort of the more moderate effects of the Indian Ocean on the far eastern side. Sorry, western side.
Just to clarify, though, from the surfing perspective, it's the Indian Ocean, but it's the southern Indian Ocean, and the water's still pretty chilly.
It's a bit chilly.
Wetsuit weather all the time in Margaret River. So just in case somebody's like, well, that means the top part is warm water and warmer. Well, not a whole lot, no.
No, it's not. Cool. And that is a bit of a look of the ocean. I don't know if that's actually right at where Margaret River is, because Margaret River does head into the ocean at one point. I mean, it's blocked off and they sort of dredge it every year or so, but I don't think that is. It's just a coastal look. But long, narrow region. It's just about 270 kilometers south of Perth, hugged by the Indian and Southern Ocean, so the dual influences there. Geographically very isolated, but really old ancient soils and very unique biodiversity. There's interesting different kinds of trees there and vegetation. It's a really interesting place to be, and it just has a wonderful feel and vibe to it. Ideal grape growing conditions. There's not a lot of there's pressure, there's bird pressure, and sometimes some moisture and mildew pressure. But the reality is that the climate there is really quite privileged. Climate-wise, Mediterranean, certainly with strong maritime influences, the ocean on three sides. They call it sort of Mediterranean. It's sort of halfway between. When we talk Mediterranean climate as an overview, that's sort of a warm maritime, and then maritime being cool maritime. I think Margaret River kind of fits between. You couldn't really call Margaret River cool climate, and you certainly wouldn't call it warm climate. Sort of right in between. Enough to be able to ripen Cabernet successfully, but still cool enough to keep it sort of poised in its position. No, altitude is not a major issue or a major factor here. There are some vineyards that do get up to like 150 meters, but not, we're not talking major altitude in this region. That's not a primary factor. Lots of different soils. There's actually a bunch of really cool limestone caves in parts of Margaret River, but the predominant well-drained sort of gravelly loams over granite, and that's the key thing here that has really pushed this region into initially being recognized as a high-quality region as well. Never mind the climate and other environmental factors, but those well-drained gravelly soils have been very, very important piece of the puzzle. But it does depend where you are. It's 100 kilometers north to south, about 25 kilometers wide, thereabouts. And so there are some varying parts. But I've seen some limestone caves in parts of Margaret River too. So limestone is a factor as well. Remember that face. She's an important face. If you have met Virginia Wilcock, you'll realize what a force of nature she is. Viticulture and winemaking. Let's see if there are some major things to remember. I think the first bullet point here is really not that different from a lot of what's happening in many parts of Australia, but it's particularly important here though. Move towards less intervention, less messing around in the vineyard, letting the plants express themselves with less chemicals, less fertilizers, and what have you. Growing adoption of organic and biodynamic practices. I have to remind myself where they are at with Vas Felix. I know that they are playing around with it. They're not quite on the same sort of fanaticism that, say, Cullen has, where they've been certified organic and biodynamic for, it's been at least 10 or 15 years. But that is a piece of the puzzle that is developing very, very quickly. High quality heritage clones. It's always been, as we mentioned in the beginning, it's always been about high quality. In Margaret River, I think it was more that they benefited by being a sort of a late comer to the business in Australia. They benefited from a better understanding of some of the vine material that existed in Australia, and some of the old clones that they've started to understand. There's some old Cabernet clones that have come out, very like the Jackman clone, which is from out west initially. And so that's kind of a positive thing and speaks a little bit to the quality of the final wines. Harvest time anywhere between sort of February and April. February would be early. April for some of the later ripening varieties can sort of extend a little bit deep into April, but generally everything's pretty much wrapped up by the end of April. Classic varieties. Now, there are some people dancing around the edges in parts of Margaret River with skin contact wines and natural wine. There's a natural wine movement, quite a sort of energetic and healthy natural wine making movement in Margaret River. But if you stop and look at all the producers that have been around for any length of time, they're all using the classic varieties that have always done really well there and playing around and watching other varieties come into prominence. But for the most part, it's about classic varieties, which we'll look at in a moment. A lot less intervention. Oak use has changed, and I think that's a consistent thing we've talked about throughout this series. Just restraint is the key now, and if they're using new oak, it's a lot less percentage of new oak. Cabernet is one of those varieties where it still benefits from a fair percentage of new oak, but generally speaking, people are backing away from that. Either larger formats, less percentage of new, or slightly larger format oak. So, and as I said, experimentation with some of these alternative techniques are coming into play as well. Not so much at classic places like Bass Felix or Cullen or Cullen a little bit, but Lewin. But we're seeing that as part of the emerging picture of Margaret River. Okay, noteworthy varieties. These are those. Cabernet, 20%. They're pretty much holding the same sort of percentage that Sauvignon Blanc does, which is interesting. And Chardonnay, while it is probably better known than 16% of the vineyard, but simply because it's the quality is so incredibly high. But Cabernet and Chardonnay, I would argue, are the two famous high quality varieties there, with Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon being the sort of the workhorse grapes, with a few exceptions, high quality exceptions there. They're the kind of varieties that have done really well to sort of establish cement the original reputation of Margaret River on for restaurants and for the press. Shiraz is a weird one in the sense that I love it, but there's almost this bizarre reluctance to talk about it when you're visiting. It's like, oh, yeah, we make some Shiraz. And I like it because I find it's a more sort of red-fruited, slightly restrained style of Shiraz compared to, say, Barossa or McLaren Vale. And I think it's a really important piece. And something, if I'm trying to show a different side of Shiraz to people, as I say, I wouldn't call it cool climate, but it's starting to get hints of that sort of character that, you get the richness and the intensity, but you just get that savory sort of red fruited notes in there that I think are really, really appealing. The variety I would put in here, and it's particularly important to Virginia at Vas Felix, is that it won't even register in terms of the numbers here, but Malbec in the blends with Cabernet is increasingly an important piece of the puzzle, in the sense that it might have been a little bit of salt and pepper seasoning in the past. It's now becoming one of those varieties that I know Virginia's talked about it for the last 10 years, and you're starting to see that Malbec does incredibly well in Margaret River. Seeing it as single varietal, I'm sure there are some that exist. I can't think of one right now, but in terms of an interesting element to add to the flavor and character of the Cabernet blends, very, very important. So, yeah, this helped put Sauvignon Blanc, or Sauvignon Blanc Semillon, depending on the blend. They're always around 50-50, 45-50, in that sort of range. They've helped to put Margaret River on the map, though. There are two varieties we know that work really well together. And the Bordelais sort of narrative is always about the richness of Semillon is balanced out by the vibrancy and the fruit of the Sauvignon Blanc. I think the way Semillon grows there in Margaret River tends to be a bit more along the lines of how Sauvignon Blanc looks. But there are two sort of styles. I think you could sort of separate it simply into two styles. It might be maybe three for the real sort of fun and affordable ones. But the reality is you've got the style in the varying sort of blends, be it Semillon or Sauvignon Blanc dominant, that come across a bit more in that framework of what you'd see, from New Zealand, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, that sort of vibrant, more sort of tropical fruit, different flavor profile than the typical sort of Marlborough versions, in that you're probably getting a bit more tropical fruit, passion fruit and lemon curd. And then you've got the wines that sort of, I think, lean a bit towards that sort of with a sort of a tip of the hat to Pessac Léognan and Grave, where they'll be oak aged, maybe built for the long term, and still totally delicious when young, but having seen a little bit of oak, they tend to need a bit more time. So you've got those two versions that exist, but for the most part, they are forward, easy drinking, vibrant wines that are, absolutely delicious and suspiciously easy to drink. You can look at these maps at your own leisure. As I've said, I'll pass those on. The other variety that, I mean, if you can't stress enough the importance of Chardonnay from Margaret River in Australia. It's been a really important piece of the evolution of Chardonnay as a variety, and the character and quality is superlative. There's definitely a style, I think, that comes out of Margaret River, richer and riper without ever being cloying. I think there's a real kind of, I mean, Lewin has always been kind of, I think Lewin and Vas Felix, I always like to use side by side, because I think it's kind of an interesting way of looking at the two, because Vas Felix tends to be a bit more restrained, a bit more sort of a wine a little bit that sort of tends to look a bit better in a year or two down the road. But the reality is, though, there's always this power. And I think the Margaret River character for Chardonnay, to my mind, is this intensity and powerful fruit, but you're never getting this cloying sensation of richness and heaviness. There's this spine of lime-like acidity that always pulls everything into check. And I think that's particularly true at Vas Felix. But yeah, really, really cool stuff with incredible age worthiness, and arguably, I mean, you could say some of the best Chardonnay produced in Australia right now is coming out of Margaret River. Wine shows would say that to you, and those publications.
Yeah, and this again is one of those places where you can take somebody out of their absolute adoration of New World wines and move them closer to the experience of European Chardonnay. Because that spine that these wines have of acidity is really remarkable. And, Cullen sort of fitting right in there in the middle of those two that you used as bookends as well, because they're sort of, I mean, I have had my socks blown off by all three of those producers for various different times and reasons, because that was just like, wow, that is just amazingly good. Mm-hmm. Chardonnay, all three of which are ageable, all three of which are great on the table. So really, it's a really it is true. Chardonnay got my attention first out of Margaret River. Absolutely.
It did mostly in the US. Most people do know it for that. And I think it's kind of cool, because if I look at your portfolio right now, I mean, what a lineup you can pull together. And we'll probably talk about this in that final session, but what a lineup you can pull together in terms of showing the premier regions and high quality producers. You pull together your M3 from Sean Smith, Toll Puddle, something probably from Yarra from Team. I'm not sure if you're bringing Team as Chardonnay in, but then to sort of round it out with something from Margaret River. I mean, you're kidding me. This is just, there's a snapshot of why Chardonnay is so important in Australia right now, and why it's making waves globally. So very cool stuff.
Yeah, and you can show the high intensity oaked versions, and then you can walk a Vas Felix out there with their unoaked version, which, man, if you're not paying attention, you think you've got a glass of Chablis, because it doesn't have the minerality, but it's got the laser sharpness that you're expecting out of a much different climate than what they're looking at. And it is really quite remarkable. The one sample bag can change the world's mind out of our portfolio on what Chardonnay tastes like in Australia.
Yeah, totally. And I saw that Toll Puddle just got that famous big award this year. 2018 got the best white wine trophy in London, which is pretty special. That's cool. Styles of Chardonnay on that slide. I will pass over that one. But no question, no matter what people talk about with the Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc, when you speak to the top producers, this is the deal for them. It's their way. We are Cabernet country, where I would argue there's a lot of things happening in Margaret River, but for sure some of the most noted wines being produced in Margaret River in terms of longevity and just character and quality would have to be the Cabernet Sauvignon. But it's rare that they're 100%. It's always a blend, but in that sort of predominant Cabernet sort of framework. All suited for long-term cellaring. You're getting that classic. What I love about Margaret River is exactly what you alluded to earlier on, is this idea, this sort of side by side. If you were to look at, say, Coonawarra, for example, there's a density of fruit and a more sort of, different sort of character or quality of tannin. And I feel like that what I love about Margaret River and why I love showing Margaret River Cab to people is it's nice to be reminded that, yes, there's power in these wines, but they can be medium to full-bodied rather than straight on full-bodied. They are just the way that the farming is there, the way the climate is. You get a little bit of this leafy quality, not sort of stemmy and green and unripe, but you get a little whiff of that sort of herbal note, which I believe completely and utterly defines Cabernet. And I think we've forgotten probably that is part of the Cabernet framework, and we get beaten into submission. This is not a criticism of Napa; it's more just climate and where people are going with it. They're riper, the fruit's hung out longer. It softens the tannins. It negates that sort of herbal quality, and that's not what they're farming for here in Margaret River. You get a bit of that lift and that whiff, and that's why I think it's a wonderful stepping stone into a sort of a more moderate framework of Cabernet. Even though the powerful fruit still exists, it's not this big over the top sort of characteristic, and I love it. I think Margaret River Cabernet is legitimately world class and belongs on the table with the very best Cabernet blends on the planet. Period.
Agreed. And you don't have to, I mean, if you ever have the privilege, I know you have had it, and I have had it a couple of times, to have some of their wines with bottle age, it confirms it immediately. They have style and grace and ageability, which are the markers of great world-class wine, regardless of where it's from. And, you know, I had a magnum of a well-known, highly regarded California producer of Cabernet that had been given to me. And I decided I would open it for Christmas Eve dinner. And the wine was gorgeous. It really was beautiful, unbelievably sumptuous wine. But in truth, it could have been just about any red grape. It didn't have real Cabernet character other than blackcurrant. And so I just wanted to echo your sentiment about the clear varietal identification that I find in Margaret River wines, as well as Coonawarra wines. But different picture of the same grape, but the varietal character is really, really well defined here.
No, it is. And I think, and I think probably, and admittedly with Vas Felix, you're dealing with the Tom Cullity, you're dealing with a very different style and an age-worthy and arguably one of the more expensive wines. And if we just stop and think about it, I don't know what that's running right now, retail, 140, 150 bucks, something. If that is the most expensive, one of the more expensive wines coming in, isn't that a nice position to be in? Because there's a lot of wine from Napa that's 150 bucks, and sometimes it's ordinary, and you get up to the $400 and $500 level, and we're talking about it. But if you look at your regular entry level, the Premier as well, I mean, that is categorically some of the best value Cabernet you can find anywhere from any Cabernet producing region. And I still think that's something that has not been driven home strongly enough, is that if you want an argument for really high quality Cabernet from anywhere, it doesn't matter where it's from, value for dollar it exists in Australia. It exists in Margaret River. And when I was doing Hong Kong Vin Expo a couple of years ago, I was doing a thing, and I say this not to be a smartass, but I was doing a seminar with some great wines, and Vas Felix, Tom Cullity was in there. I think it was the 14, maybe the first or second vintage they made of it, switching it from the Heytesbury to the Cullity. And Phil Reedman, who's a master of wine, and there was a couple other guys, and he just tapped me on the shoulder and said, I think that may be one of the greatest Cabernet-based wines I've ever had from Australia, period. He's been living there for 30 years, and he's a master of wine. And I had to agree with him. I've got a bottle in the cellar, and I just tried to keep my hands off it. But, I mean, you're dealing with, categorically one of the great red wines being produced in Australia right now with that top-end wine, never mind the affordability of the other wines. It's a pretty exciting thing. And then you meet Virginia. I was like, what else is there, Anyway, onwards. So yeah, short history, but really, there's a big narrative around Margaret River. So an exciting time, and you can, overlay. We've talked very heavily about Vas Felix, but didn't mean to exclude Howard Park out of that equation. But if you've got the opportunity to work your way through some of those wines with people, I mean, the value is incredibly good at Howard Park as well. And so top wines. Great Southern, a quick sort of snapshot of Great Southern. It'll be more just sort of me chatting about it. It's not one of our modules necessarily, not because we don't believe in it. It's just that it's hard to get access to the wines. I'm trying to think of the amount of Great Southern wines that are available in the US now. I think there's maybe 4 or 5 producers. That's about it. I was lucky enough to visit here a few years ago. So if you're looking at where it is, I've got a couple of maps up here. So Margaret River here, and then you carry on down through into this region here, this broad, expansive region here. And it's made up of a bunch of little subregions. I'll come back to this map in a moment because we'll talk about the subregions as we go through. In terms of its size, the region itself, the GI itself is big. Now, there are 5 subregions in there. We'll talk about that. But it's 150 kilometers from east to west and 100 kilometers north to south. So it is not a small region, a small GI. So to be able to say, oh, yeah, well, here's what here's what Great Southern does well. That's kind of impossible because you've got all manner of different things depending on the sub-region and depending on the vineyard sites. Wide range of climates from strongly maritime influence, because like with Albany and Denmark, those sub-regions are right on the coast, to sort of almost semi-continental climate. Correspondingly, very varied topography and soils. You can't just have a blanket statement about Great Southern. What you can say is it's very cool, it's really beautiful, and there's incredible diversity and clarity in the wines there as well.
When you say very cool, are you speaking climate or just,
both?
Man, this is a sweet,
both
fun place? Okay.
Both uses of the term, yeah.
Okay, very good.
It's remote, and you're really struck by this because you fly out to Perth, and Perth is a major city. It's a big city, but there's nothing around it. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's probably the most remote major city of anywhere on the planet. And then you're driving 4 or 5 hours to get down to Great Southern, and yeah, you really are in the middle of nowhere. But it is beautiful, and it's the scenery and everything's awesome. So the 5 GIs that make it up: Franklin River, Mount Barker, Denmark, Albany, and Parongarup. I'm trying to remember exactly where fruit comes from. I know that you've got stuff in the Howard Park lineup from Mount Barker. Don't know about Franklin River, and I think Parongarup, but I think it's mostly Mount Barker, which is Shiraz and Cabernet country. But to whip back to those, just as a quick sort of overview and sort of talking about the varieties that do well here. Down in the south here, Pinot and Chardonnay do really well. I wouldn't say that's the case up in these north and the more inland cooler areas, continental climate areas. But it's interesting to try wines from Albany and Denmark. Not that they affect necessarily your portfolio, but I've had really delicious Pinot from Denmark. I know that sounds kind of ridiculous. Nice way to sort of have some fun with your wine geek friends. I'm having Pinot from Denmark. But heading up into red wine territory here, you've got great Shiraz and great Cabernet in Mount Barker. There's also really good, same for Franklin River, there's also really, really good world-class Riesling coming out of both of these regions, as well as Chardonnay. But the Riesling in particular, I get a real kick out of, in the sense that it's not that lemon-lime discussion that you get from, it's still citrusy, but it's more of this orangey and orange blossom sort of a quality that comes out of Great Southern Riesling. So I think that's kind of a cool thing too. But yeah, awesome. And you remember, next stop here is Antarctica, straight south. So those cooling breezes there are significant when they come through, and they make their way up these river valleys into Franklin River and even in parts of Mount Barker, depending on the time of day. So, and then why they matter, why your producers matter here. I mean, there's not much more you can say about Vas Felix other than the fact that it is one of Australia's top producers, period. Never mind Margaret River's top producers. With that history and sort of pedigree, even though it's young by Australian standards, it's not by Margaret River standards. They've been producing since '67 and constantly refining. Just a quick aside, and you might be able to use this for sales. Like, I don't know. It was told to me by their export director, and I don't know if it was true, but I like the story. And that the Vas Felix, the bird there, is actually a falcon. And from what I heard, and Virginia didn't deny or agree with this, but one of the issues in Margaret River is bird pressure. And early in the piece, they thought they'd try out using the falcons, where, a falconer would come, and during the difficult times of when bird pressure was at its highest, falcons would just circle the vineyards, and that would keep all the nasty birds away from attacking the fruit. And the trials worked brilliantly, and they thought, well, this is awesome. No one else is really trying this. And this was, many years ago. So they invited the press and did this big lunch and a launch, and then thought, here's something that we're trying in terms of, keeping birds at bay without any chemicals or any guns or anything like that. They released the falcon, and it just flew away, and they never saw it again. And so they sort of commemorated that in the Vas Felix label. So I don't know. Howard Park, Margaret River as well. There's a portion of it based in Margaret River, but they're also in Great Southern. So Janice is the new winemaker, and I'm seeing a massive, not that I didn't like the wines before, because I actually absolutely did, but she was at Stella Bella, and she's got a wonderful reputation and history behind her. And I'm noticing a refinement and fine tuning of the wines over the last couple of vintages since she's been in charge. So 2 top producers. And I think, Howard Park, I think for you guys and some of those other wines that are sort of stuck in the that come from the Great Southern appellation, it's kind of a nice thing to pull out from time to time. Just something a little bit different, a little bit off the beaten path. And I think more and more customers are happy to try something a little different, stepping away from sort of the norm. So yeah, two top producers that you're lucky to have.
And definitely the Shiraz wines from Howard Park are a great option because we still have some with bottle age, that like we can still sell some 15 vintage here in mid-Atlantic, which I hate to say because we shouldn't be necessarily proud of that, but it's an advantage at the moment to introduce it while we're catching up and show, hey man, this wine's great. And the other single plug for Howard Park and for anyone checking in on this, don't be afraid to take the SEMILLON Sauvignon Blanc blend from Howard Park out with, it actually tastes better. The older vintage that we have right now tastes better and more exciting than the vintage before it because that wine needs time to develop and come into its own. And it's a cool little secret that that you can share with the right clients and make some serious dent. And the wine's super affordable considering the quality you're getting in that sort of Bordelaise blend style. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have a significant amount of oak, but man, wine's just gorgeous. Yeah. Starting the older, I think it's the 17 that we have in stock here in the Mid-Atlantic is getting that beautiful Semillon slightly oiliness that makes it so charming. So both of these producers are well worth exploring for our team. If you haven't tried them, by all means, get some experience with them. You'll be a fan really quick. And if you need any information on them, Howard Park, I do have some Tasty Expectation recordings of the Flint Rock Shiraz for sure. And those are on our YouTube channel. By the way, if anybody has any questions, the Q&A is open, but we need to get them in quickly so we can let Mark back into his educational duties for the rest of the world and not monopolize too much of his time. Okay, so here's a question that just popped up from Andy. Can you speak to the Gingin Chardonnay clone Vas Felix uses? What are the standouts, if any, of this idea? Gingin is one of the popular clones in Australia and also known as Mendoza clone, I believe, if you look at
there was a bit of controversy about how that's all come out now, and Chuck, an American guy, just wrote a piece on it, and I'll try and find it for and forward it through to you. But great question, Andy. The Gingin clone is it is essentially like close to the Mendoza clone, but it's something that's always been in Margaret River. It's not that well used in other parts of Australia, but it's always been the signature. And that it's kind of an interesting clone in the sense that other clones are in Margaret River now. The Dijon clones 95 and a few of the others. But people love Gingin because it's a weird one. It has a problem at its fruit set, flowering and fruit set, because they get the hen and chicken thing. And by that, what they mean is have you ever seen photos of a bunch of grapes or Chardonnay that is sort of irregularly fruit set, meaning they've got bigger berries and some sort of underformed, underripe berries. They seem to like this element in Margaret River in the sense that you get this richness and ripeness from the fuller berries and a little bit of that restraint and acidity from the slightly underripe berries. It's just kind of this weird thing that seems to work in their favor. I'll look into the origins for the geek factor. I'll look into the origins of it. But yeah, Vas Felix is, along with many, many other producers, have steadfastly stuck by Gingin clone. I do believe that they're playing around with the other clones that exist now, the Dijon clones that are available too. But Gingin, by and large, you can go through winery to winery, and there's very few producers that aren't using it. I think, Voyager Estate, for example, may not use it at all, but for the most part, Gingin is being used by virtually everyone. It's not just a Vas Felix thing, and it contributes to that character, that power and intensity, along with that sort of fine line of acidity. Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of why it's been popular. And it's a Mendoza clone, but if you want to be cool, you say Gingin.
Yeah. And Andy, if you want to peek into the Margaret River course inside Winebow Learning, you will find that the Gingin clone is discussed with the other clones that are grown there, give you at least a sentence or two on each one and where at least we thought, our research said they came from, although, that stuff's always evolving. So
yeah, there was
keep an eye on it.
Yeah, there was a big debate recently, and I know that one of the guys, Chuck Hayward, just wrote something. He followed it up on a blog post, and it's somewhere, and then I'll find out for you. And then I also got the winemaker. It was a question that came up at Decanted last year, and the winemaker from Lewin sent me something. So I'll flick it through to you, and you can.
Okay, that'd be great. Yeah, I'll share it with the Pioneer team for sure.
Yep.
Any other questions? Get them in now. Andy says thank you.
No problem. Pleasure.
And well, that's great. I appreciate another session. I'm really looking forward to the next one. For everybody on the webinar today, we are going to go a little less heavy and a little bit more practical. We're going to put some wines in front of each of us. We're going to talk about them in the global scope as well as in the Australian scope and taste through them, and give you hopefully some notes on wines, maybe from our perspective, that you haven't tasted yet or haven't had the access to and are planning on it. Or maybe you just want to then take that information straight to your clientele and transfer it that way. That's going to be cool. I always love listening to you talk about Australia. Thank you very much, Mark. And I look forward to next time.
My pleasure. Yeah, I do too, because we're actually tasting wine. Imagine that. It's been a year.
Yes.
Wine tasting? Never heard of it.
All right.
My pleasure. Nice to see you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.